Hello and welcome to Brownie Ponders, in which I, an actual Brownie, ponder over matters of philosophy, politics, psychology, sociology, and so on. Today we're going to be examining why suffering isn't bad. Before you head to the comments to write about my reptilian cold-heartedness, hear me out. Do you ever wonder why humans tend to value the qualities of humans who have suffered? Why is that? In my personal opinion, this is because, like surgery or exercise, we inherently realize that much of the suffering we endure aids us in becoming functional, healthy, and productive members of society. Further supporting this hypothesis is that those who live pampered, sheltered lives and have not undergone any notable form of suffering are typically unlikable to their fellow humans because they're perceived to lack the insight, understanding, and fortitude of those who have braved adversity. Let's break this down even further. But before we get started, I'll reiterate that all points expressed over the course of this video are a product of my personal opinions, perspectives, and perceptions. Don't treat it as fact because it isn't. I feel that it would be difficult to move on before clarifying that there are, of course, societally imposed guidelines of what sorts of tribulations are considered to be acceptable and virtuous. For example, a person who contracted cancer in spite of leading a healthy life will be perceived very differently than a person who suffers broken bones after crashing their car because they were driving under the influence. And this distinction is necessary and reasonable in many cases. We cannot simply relinquish responsibility because we suffered as a result of our personal choices. As the famous saying goes, you made your bed, and now you must lay in it. But like many distinctions, it begs the question, where do the boundaries lie? This debate has fueled many raging political brawls in recent years, such as pro-life versus pro-choice, capital punishment versus no capital punishment, and pro-deterrence versus pro-rehabilitation, to name a few. And the issue with distinctions is that they rely upon a universal code of morals. In the past, this universal code of morals typically aligned with whatever religion chiefly governed the state, but since the separation of church and state, this is no longer a sound means of determining moral guidelines. Everyone believes different things, and so there's no rigid common moral ground beyond very basic standards, such as that it is generally unacceptable to kill or maim another human or trip pregnant women without good reason. And even then, there's quite a bit of give depending on the local jurisdiction you consult. But returning from that offshoot, I've observed that in general, humans pity and admire those who did not play an obviously direct part in eliciting the negative consequences they endured. Here, let's do a bit of a reflective exercise. On the count of 3, I'm going to briefly describe 2 individuals, and each time you should monitor the first thoughts that pop into your head. Feel free to comment what your initial thoughts of each of these 2 individuals were. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Jonas, the high school dropout and heroin addict. One more time. 1, 2, 3. Lisa, the sergeant's young widow. Both of these people are suffering in an objective sense, but I highly suspect that you had widely varying initial impressions of the aforementioned individuals. And don't worry, that doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a normal person, who, to maintain moral equilibrium, has created a complex network of right and wrongs with which to process the happenings of life. Similar to how types of suffering can be categorized as acceptable or unacceptable, who suffers also warrants widely differing societal reactions. It's pretty much a truth universally acknowledged that society is more sympathetic towards a suffering child than a suffering adult. And similarly, suffering elders are also held in higher regard than their younger adult counterparts. This is largely based in sound facts, as children and the elderly are more physically and mentally vulnerable than the majority. Gender also plays a large role in how suffering is received. Women, generally speaking, are far more likely to elicit empathy due to their suffering as opposed to men. When female children cry, their parents typically ask them what's wrong. When male children cry, they're typically told to stop because boys don't cry. There's even the famous expression man up, rendering masculinity synonymous with mental fortitude and strength, and femininity with emotionality and vulnerability. Now that we've discussed the more objective societal parameters of suffering, let's discuss why suffering isn't inherently wrong and in many cases can actually be very advantageous. Vanity, envy, wrath, laziness, avarice, gluttony, and lust. What common theme can be detected amongst Dante's 7 deadly vices? We're most susceptible to them in the pursuit of pleasure or the alleviation of physical and mental discomfort. Take laziness, for example. We're lazy often because it's difficult and unpleasant to buckle down and complete the day's work. We're gluttonous because it feels good to eat ourselves into a stupor. We're envious because we want what pleasantries others have for our own enjoyment. What separates these vices from the logical and reasonable steps we take to avoid long-term negative consequences is an utter lack of foresight. Avoiding jumping out of a moving car is a good utilization of foresight, while eating french fries for breakfast, lunch, and dinner is gluttonous and will have disastrous overall implications for future well-being. Conversely, virtues such as courage, integrity, fortitude, humility, and empathy are typically developed and honed as a result of adverse experiences. We learn to be courageous because we're afraid, we cultivate fortitude because of pain, and we feel empathy by relating our suffering to others. It's at this point that we must establish a distinction between reasonable and unreasonable forms of suffering. Reasonable suffering is not necessarily always somebody's deliberate fault. Rather, it may be nobody's fault or distributed out indirectly over an indeterminate number of circumstances. For example, some of us grew up in a financially precarious predicament. This might have made us less wasteful, more appreciative of the things we have, and more sympathetic towards others in need. This is reasonable suffering. But a homeless person who suffers a knife attack at random in the streets will likely not come out of this experience with any beneficial developments. They will likely suffer from serious injuries, extreme fear, and psychological trauma that will impede their daily affairs and interactions. This event would not qualify as a necessary evil because no one benefited. The perpetrator has only become a worse person as a result of their actions, and the victim has sustained pointless mental and physical trauma. This is unreasonable suffering. Of course, this distinction doesn't always appear so clear-cut. In many scenarios, it's difficult to identify if the benefits outweigh the costs. For example, humans have been waging wars since the beginning of time, and it's clear that these wars have catastrophic effects. Many wars have yielded positive results. Still others leave many dead with little to show for their sacrifice. When does the suffering become wrong, and who decides? The victors, the sufferers, the bystanders? I don't have the answers, and I don't think any one person or even any one nation can make a concrete and universally accepted distinction concerning where reasonable suffering ends and where unreasonable suffering begins. We've remained mostly within the boundaries of reality so far, so let's shift and explore the hypothetical. A world in which no one suffers sounds ideal, doesn't it? Well, the dystopian genre says otherwise. Have you ever watched WALL-E? If you haven't, WALL-E is a kid's movie about a lone robot who spends his time tidying up a wasteland like Earth abandoned by humans and ravaged of all its resources. Later in the movie, WALL-E winds up on a massive spaceship that houses all of humanity. On this ship, every human need is cared for by the supercomputer so that humans no longer have to walk, feed themselves, or exert any effort to exist. They are all morbidly obese, immobile, and completely hedonistic, pandering only to their desires whilst robots essentially maintain them. As far-fetched or hilarious as this dystopian scenario sounds, the core ideas at the base of such an existence are not so far-fetched. In modern years, it's becoming increasingly more common to emotionally and psychologically protect ourselves from pain with short-term solutions rather than with long-term lifestyle changes. For example, getting unnecessary and or risky cosmetic surgeries to achieve a certain look, rather than learning to love our most natural form and redirecting our self-worth so it isn't based so heavily upon our outward appearance. This time-consuming process will most certainly not be easy, but it'll be better for us in the long term. Nothing meaningful and beneficial in this world comes to us with complete ease. In a painless world, humans would exist only in the pursuit of pleasure, essentially infantilizing themselves and ridding us of all need for composure, a higher understanding of existence, and a moral code to live by. Life would lose meaning because there would be no reason to strive and nothing to strive for. Initially, we would indulge our senses with pleasurable substances and experiences, and then the threshold would rise, as it always does with pleasant things. We would ingest more and more niceties until we reach the very precipice of pleasure and would eventually plateau. Because if you ascend unobstructed, you're bound to hit a ceiling sooner or later. Then we would have to live with the realization that our existence is meaningless, tasteless, and exhausted of its enjoyment. As Cody Fry said, perfection is so quick to bore. In my experience and observation, one of the best ways to amplify your misery is to have held unrealistic expectations beforehand. Let me give you a bit of a scenario to put this into perspective. Say you and your hypothetical or real partner are expecting a child, and you're convinced that your kid is definitely going to be perfect. Unlike everyone else's baby, yours is going to keep quiet at night. It'll calm down when you pick it up, it'll eat what it's supposed to, and it'll start walking at exactly 12 months. When the baby is born, you learn that sadly it doesn't meet these expectations. It cries profusely at all hours of the night, it hates you and prefers your partner, it's a picky eater, and it spits up what it doesn't like. And it doesn't start walking until it's 2 years old. You're probably thinking, duh, you would have to be pretty out of touch with reality to expect that much from a baby. And you would be right. If you exist in any plane of reality similar to ours, you would know from experience that kids are just as problematic as they can be joyous. You would have to look no further than your own childhood to figure that out. Now apply that same logic to suffering. Humans have been suffering and will continue to do so long as they exist. There's no good reason for you to think you'll be an exception to that rule. I'd be so bold as to say don't bother having expectations in that aspect because you'll be sorely disappointed. And this doesn't mean that you should consciously accept less than you deserve. Rather, it means you shouldn't realistically expect everything to go the way it should, or the way you want it to. You'll find that if you view the world through such a lens, you'll harbor less resentment and disappointment. Furthermore, you'll come to peace with the reality that you are the ship, not the sea. You'll be tossed about and your job is simply to steer the ship to the best of your ability, not to yell at and curse the waves, wondering why they don't bend to your whims. You will suffer in this world, and you'll suffer a lot. Some of it will be warranted, and some of it won't be. And there's pretty much nothing you can do to prevent all of it. You can try, but you'll definitely fail in some aspect, and there's nothing wrong with that. Rest assured that everyone on Earth can bond over the fact that they will or already have suffered to some degree. You can either allow your negative experiences to define you, preventing you from growing and polluting your perception of the world, or you can make the best out of them and appreciate the strength you've built as a result of overcoming them and triumphing as a brand new, improved person. I highly suggest the latter. Thank you for taking the time to hear me out. Most people aren't willing to give a brownie the time of day, especially concerning human issues. I hope you'll lend me more of your time in the future. Don't forget to drive yourself insane by doubting everything you think to be true, and have a great day.